Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Playing Catch-Up, How Federal Policy is Lagging Behind State Cannabis Programs, presented by David Mangone, Director of Government Affairs, Legislative Counsel for Americans for Safe Access. My name is Xavier Gutierrez, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking website and producer of educational virtual events and webinars. Now, before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want during the presentation. Simply click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and type your questions into the drop-down box. Our speaker will respond to your questions via email following the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing your presentation, please click on the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're experiencing a problem. And this presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located in the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Mangone. I will now turn the presentation over to him.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you are streaming this webinar from. My name is David Mangone. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for Americans for Safe Access. Americans for Safe Access is the nation's largest nonprofit dedicated to representing the interests of medical cannabis patients, researchers, and professionals. We have about 100,000 members across the United States, with chapters in all 50 states and several of the U.S. territories. Who are all working to change cannabis policy on the state and federal level. So I'm very excited to be part of this LabRoots virtual conference and welcome your questions throughout the presentation. So to begin, disclosures. Aside from my employment with Americans for Safe Access, I have no financial relationship that could reasonably be viewed as a conflict of interest or an appearance of a conflict of interest with any of the other presenters or any of the products being presented at this conference. So as I go through this presentation, I hope that there's two things that really you all can focus on. And the first is identifying what areas states have chosen to regulate medical cannabis and cannabis for non-medical uses, as well as recognizing what policy change must be left up to the federal government that can't be determined by the state. So with those two things in mind, I'd like to get started with a national overview. Currently, there are 47 states that have some form of law on the books that is different from the Federal Controlled Substances Act. Whether this is a comprehensive medical cannabis program, a program that allows cannabidiol or CBD only, or a program that allows the non-medical use of cannabis, there's a significant national trend on where states are headed in terms of countering federal policy on this issue. So the way our organization looks at these programs and defines a comprehensive program is states that offer substantial access to medical cannabis through a variety of delivery methods, through patients being able to use medicine through a distribution system, or have protections that are greater than an affirmative defense and when folks get prosecuted and arrested by state law officials. So right now we have 33 states that are considered quote unquote comprehensive, with another 14 states that have cannabidiol only programs. Within those states, there's 10 plus the District of Columbia that allow for the non-medical use of cannabis. So when you look at this from a patient perspective, we estimate there's approximately 2.5 million medical cannabis patients currently in the United States. I put an asterisk with this number because some states like California and Maryland don't require patients to obtain an ID card to receive the protections of the program. Some states do have mandatory requirements that requires patients to obtain an ID card, participate in a medical cannabis registry, but some do not. So this is our best guess estimate based on the numbers that are produced from departments of health and from these medical cannabis programs within the state. We've estimated that approximately 0.16 to up to 2% of a total population will be eligible for medical cannabis programs, depending on state condition lists and how states identify participation in the program. So obviously, even at 2% in states like Colorado and California, this is not really a sufficient amount of patients enrolling in a population compared to the larger healthcare system. So the way we, I think something that we typically hear a lot as an advocacy organization from opponents of the legalization of medical cannabis is that everyone will be using this and this will cause all sorts of problems. We really see that the use of medical cannabis is really strictly limited to an already small patient population. So the fears and concerns that this would be widespread and sort of replace all healthcare systems is sort of a little bit unfounded. So for a graphic representation of where we are in terms of cannabis laws, this map shows in the darker shaded pink the states that have passed a comprehensive medical cannabis program. It's primarily the Northeast, the West Coast, and then a few states scattered throughout the middle of the country. The striped pink indicates states that have passed cannabidiol-only programs. These programs are typically quite limited. Some of them do not have in-state distribution systems. Some are limited only to intractable epilepsy. But by and large, these programs don't provide access for large lists of conditions or large subsets of the patient population. So looking at this map, there's only 3 states that don't have any sort of law on the books whatsoever regarding medical cannabis or regarding CBD. And those are Idaho, South Dakota, and Nebraska. And there's already been interest in Idaho for the 2020 election with a ballot initiative to move forward medical cannabis legislation. There's been interest in the Nebraska State House about pushing forward medical cannabis legislation. Interestingly enough, though, the South Dakota Attorney General recently issued a memo saying that CBD and hemp are both still illegal under state law, which is somewhat contradictory to the farm bill that was passed earlier this year that largely legalized industrial hemp and CBD derived from plants containing 0.3% or less THC. So we'll be watching these states closely, the 3 without programs, as well as the states that currently only have CBD programs, to see how they will advance medical cannabis legislation moving forward throughout the rest of 2019 and into 2020. So currently, the Controlled Substances Act and a variety of other legislative statutes and executive agencies prevent most of what's considered legal activity in these state programs. States can go ahead and legalize programs however they see fit, as we've seen since 1996. States have been, going against the federal authority of the Controlled Substances Act, of the Department of Justice, and passing their own cannabis laws. But while states do this, there is no functioning framework under federal law and under the Constitution that allows this to actually move forward. There's an argument that the 10th Amendment allows states to set their own policies based on the health and welfare of their citizens, but the Department of Justice and the Drug Enforcement Administration have disagreed with this position, and seeing as they are the prosecuting agencies, they would probably be given deference in a federal court, at least at this time. We've seen some federal courts agree with patients and side with states who have passed these programs, but the official position of our government agencies on the federal level is that cannabis of any kind is still illegal, and these laws that are being passed that allow for the medical use or the non-medical use are inconsistent with federal policy and federal priorities. So in 2014, there was a document issued by the Department of Justice that seemed to give some cover for state legal cannabis businesses. This document was known as the Cole Memorandum. It was written and authored by Deputy Attorney General James Cole. And what this document did is it outlined 8 policies for the Department of Justice in terms of which cases they would take to prosecute and which they would not in terms of department resources. So this memo looked at things like restricting access to minors, preventing diversion, preventing grows on public lands. And what this memo did is, while it didn't really create any new law at the Department of Justice, it did outline a policy that allowed states to develop programs that were consistent and compliant with this memo. So after 2014, you saw an explosion of states developing medical cannabis programs with policy priorities consistent with this memo. Some states even took the memo's language and worked it into their own legislative statutes. A good example of this is Alaska, where in the statute itself, it lists out the Cole Memo priorities and says that the same priorities exist for Alaska's medical program. Now, Alaska also allows for the non-medical use of cannabis, but the policy priorities established by the Cole Memo are still very much an integral part of Alaska's program. So this guidance was, I think, something that allowed the industry, both for the medical side and for the non-medical side, to flourish for the years following 2014. It acted as a cover and acted as sort of tentative legal backing that businesses could rely on when they entered into this space. So in 2018, this memorandum and other guidance that had been issued by the Justice Department outlining policies when it came to cannabis were rescinded by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions. For a while, it seemed as though this was going to be a significant step backwards for medical cannabis and the medical cannabis industry. However, a lot of players and manufacturers ended up coalescing around this rescission and making sure that they were very compliant with state law, and particularly those state laws that had identified the same priorities as the Cole Memo. So where we stand right now with this is Attorney General Sessions issued guidance, returned full prosecutorial discretion to district attorneys and federal law enforcement that said that they could use all resources available to them to prosecute cases that dealt with cannabis. We haven't really seen that in terms of a federal crackdown. And now Attorney General William Barr, in his confirmation hearing, indicated that he would not be using Justice Department resources to go after these state programs. So aside from this memo, the only real legal protections that exist for state-level medical cannabis programs is an amendment that appears annually in the congressional appropriations process. This amendment was introduced several times before finally being incorporated in a spending bill by Representative Sam Farr and Maurice Hinchey. It finally was put into place by Sam Farr and Dana Rohrabacher, and has gone through a few iterations and has most recently been led by Earl Blumenauer from Oregon and Dave Joyce from Ohio. So what this amendment does is it prevents the Department of Justice from spending any money to prosecute people who are compliant with state law in terms of implementing medical cannabis programs. This amendment, for the first time last year, was put in base text of an appropriations bill. What that means is it did not have to be voted on the House floor to be included as part of the budget. So this certainly marks, I think, a tepid acceptance by some members of Congress, at least, that these state medical cannabis programs particularly are not going away, and that the federal government is taking, at least for now, a hands-off approach. However, this amendment has to be renewed every year, so there's no lasting protections outside of this appropriations process for these state programs as they continue to develop and create their own medical cannabis laws. This protection has been slightly extended by some court decisions. The most notable, of course, is U.S. versus McIntosh. This was a Ninth Circuit decision that held the Department of Justice cannot spend its funds to prosecute individuals who are compliant with state medical cannabis laws. This included patients as well as healthcare professionals. The language of the Appropriations Amendment, read directly, seems to only cover those who are helping implement state-level medical cannabis laws. However, this seems to extend these protections to a broader base of the population. So with that all being said, the protections from the annual appropriations rider, as well as the decisions that have come from circuit cases and the comments and actions by former and current attorney generals, leaves us where we currently are. So states, in response to I think California and Maine and Hawaii and Washington State sort of leading the early charge to develop medical cannabis laws, have created their policies around the idea that the federal government will not be interfering into these state operations. So where states have really developed this policy is in several categories. And the first is testing and quality control. Each year, Americans for Safe Access, my organization, grades each state's program on where they are in terms of providing patient access and providing safe and quality medicine. So this map to the right indicates our grades from last calendar year and ending December 31st of 2017, excuse me. And this sort of shows that no program has achieved an A grade by our standards yet. There are some states that are close with B pluses, but there's a lot of things, even for the states that have the longest developed programs, there's still room for improvement. So states, having not received guidance from the federal government, have looked at several categories where they can improve access to safe medicine. And the first and major one is testing and quality control. The federal government hasn't introduced any standards whatsoever when it comes to testing cannabis like they have with some other agricultural crops, pesticide levels. So states have created systems on their own that create various mechanisms to determine the content of THC in certain plants, the content of other cannabinoids, recall protocols. So these have all been developed without federal guidance, which you typically see in other industries, other agencies. They certainly have borrowed from federal principles, but not in the same way that we've seen with other regulated industries, pharmaceuticals, alcohol, et cetera. States have also had the opportunity to develop product safety controls. What this means is the priorities of the Cole Memo that encouraged preventing diversion to minors and preventing diversion generally. You've seen many states implement a track and trace system where a plant will be monitored and intensely watched from its seed to final sale, and then sometimes beyond. You've seen states develop strong content for packaging, for labeling, making sure that things aren't marketed in a way that they would appeal to children, that they appropriately identify the active ingredient, typically THC, though it could be another cannabinoid. And you, I think, have seen states approach this in a variety of ways. California has done an adequate job with Prop 64, the legislation that passed their adult use ballot initiative. It called for a lot more testing and labeling standards. However, in some states, these are almost non-existent, and you just have to trust the product that you are getting is whatever the dispensary says it is. So it's something that certainly could be improved across the board if there were minimum federal standards, like there are with some other food products, some other medication products. It perhaps would help these states that lag behind in packaging and labeling and testing standards develop standards of their own that effectively and adequately convey the product that's being sold. States have also been on their own to develop distribution frameworks. Under the Controlled Substances Act, federally, the distribution of cannabis can be associated with jail time, with hefty fines. So states have had to figure out ways and mechanisms to get cannabis to individual patients. Some states have allowed the home cultivation of cannabis. Other states prevent home cultivation, but allow for patients to go to state licensed dispensaries or allow for only distribution to certain people. Some allow for delivery. So this has been, again, a very state-based approach in terms of how to develop getting medicine from one point to another. That's outside of the traditional medical supply chain that we see with other medications. States have also been allowed and widely able to set their own tax rates. Where you see a big difference is in the states that have allowed for cannabis for non-medical purposes. You typically see much higher tax rates than medical cannabis. Some states have decided to tie their medical cannabis tax rates to the same rate that pharmaceuticals are taxed in that state. Some states have not wanted to tax patients and not tax this as a medication, but have found other ways to generate revenue through excise tax and sales tax. But all of the states that have cannabis programs currently have vastly different approaches to how this is taxed and how this could be a revenue generator, if at all. And the last way, really, that states have developed policy without guidance from the federal government is on the issue of civil rights. And this category broadly includes things like employment testing, child custody proceedings, and even some things that typically lie in the federal purview, like gun ownership, but states have begun to approach the civil rights aspect of being a medical cannabis patient. There's no sweeping guidance other than saying that certain individuals should lose some of their rights from the federal government. A good example is from housing and urban development. They have a policy that requires landlords to deny admittance to tenants who are medical cannabis patients upon application. But if they discover that there's a patient who is a tenant and they are already living in a federally subsidized property, it's up to the landlord's discretion on whether or not they want to institute eviction proceedings. So states have taken a vastly different approach. For a little bit more detail on how we graded these states, what's the difference between an A and an F, I encourage everyone who's watching this presentation to go onto our website and look at our State of States report. It has the detailed categories and the different approaches that the states have taken on this issue. So with the last two Congresses, we've seen more legislative activity than I think we ever have before in any other congressional setting in terms of introduced legislation and fixes to resolve this federal-state conflict. Some notable ones right now are bills like the Marijuana Justice Act, which focuses on the equity and racial injustices caused by the drug war. There's a number of medical cannabis research bills, both through the Veterans Affairs Department and through other agencies. There's a few that try to regulate cannabis like alcohol. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of approaches right now to attempt to fix this. but we still have not gotten, I think, significant enough movement from the federal government to indicate that prohibition is ending anytime in the very near future. And a reason for this is some roadblocks to reform. Many opponents of cannabis reform point to the fact that there's a lack of data. And this is, I think, a way to hide behind the tremendous amount of data that I'm sure will be presented during this conference, as well as currently floating out there. What these opponents typically mean is there's not enough data that's been funded by the United States federal government. There are plenty of studies from around the world, as well as from private researchers, that show the medical benefits of cannabis. And even a government agency, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicines, has issued an extensive report in 2017 highlighting a review of the current research, proposing such findings that cannabis is effective for chronic pain, as well as some other findings as well. So I think as we move forward and as more countries legalize medical cannabis and put forward research, it's going to be harder and harder to hide behind this as a reason for opposition. Another reason is, despite 94% of public support for medical cannabis, a lot of lawmakers don't view this as a critical mass issue. There was a poll that was issued to prospective voters for 2020. It was open-ended. It asked, what is your top priority for the 2020 election? And only 2% of respondents indicated cannabis or drug reform in any way as a reason why they would go to the polls. So many lawmakers don't see this as a win or lose issue yet. I think that some of their constituents would disagree and would be willing to have this be the sole reason as to why or why not to elect someone, but it's still interesting nonetheless. So as we move forward, I think there is a concerted effort, particularly in the House of Representatives, to move cannabis policy forward. Last year, 2 research bills passed out of committee for the first time. That was the first time that we had seen any progress on cannabis legislation, really, since the Controlled Substances Act was passed. And today, the day I'm recording this webinar, the House Financial Services Committee will vote on the Safe Banking Act, which provides avenues for cannabis businesses to gain financial services. The vote will have been completed by the time the LabRoots conference happens later this week. So the results from that should be up. But with a Democratic-controlled House, it looks like it is going to be a favorable result, at least from the House side. But time will tell to see if the Senate will also agree with those principles. While there's movement in the House of Representatives, there's not a whole lot of movement right now with federal agencies that have a hand in regulating cannabis. All of these logos right here are agencies that are in some way tied to cannabis policy. The big ones, of course, are organizations like the Drug Enforcement Administration, which controls illegal grows and looks to license producers. The FDA, which is going to be, I think, producing more cannabis-based medicines after the approval of Epidiolex. And then some less obvious ones. I included the logo of the EPA here because the EPA has issued a notice basically saying that all cannabis is a non-conforming use, so the EPA won't provide pesticide guidance for cannabis as a crop. I also included the Department of Education. There is certainly still the risk that individuals who are granted federal student loans can lose those loans based on cannabis convictions. And there is certainly a fear from research universities that they don't want to research the effects of medical cannabis because they fear that they might lose federal funding. So this goes into a little bit more detail about the last slide. When we look to some of these legislative proposals that are currently floating around Congress, a lot of them deal with rescheduling or descheduling cannabis as a substance, but doesn't really talk about what happens. So this slide details changes that certainly would be needed to be taken by some of these federal agencies to ensure that the descheduling or rescheduling of cannabis was actually effective. An example is ensuring banking access, or with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ensuring that medical cannabis patients would be able to purchase a firearm because there's currently a federal prohibition on that. So just to touch more on the policies of federal agencies, these highlight some of the current restrictions that medical cannabis patients face. Up top is a warning from ATF, as I just mentioned. The warning is on a form that's used for sale of firearms that says, warning, the possession or use of marijuana remains unlawful under federal law, regardless of whether it has been legalized or decriminalized for medical or recreational purposes in the state which you reside. This slide also includes information about loan eligibility and then policies that HUD has put in place, as I mentioned earlier. So recognizing that a lot of federal agencies need to do concrete action to help fix the state-federal conflict, my organization, Americans for Safe Access, has proposed a new federal strategy that consolidates a lot of federal resources from all of those agencies and creates a new oversight body of medical cannabis. Well, this would allow states to still have some level of control with licensing, but because so many agencies are involved, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, Drug Enforcement Administration, Department of Justice, the FDA, Health and Human Services, it becomes a issue of the old expression, too many cooks. And you have over a dozen agencies trying to implement and influence cannabis policy right now, and it just becomes untenable. So we have proposed to consolidate some of those efforts and energies. We will see if it's something that is palpable to this Congress. But I want to talk a little bit more about things that the states cannot do right now. And the first big one is veterans health care. States are unable, states with VA programs, being Veterans Administration, are unable to have those VA care providers assist their patients fill out paperwork or recommendation forms for these state programs. All of those decisions have to be on the federal level. So states can provide discounts for veterans. They can provide less stringent requirements for veterans to join their programs, but they can't direct the VA hospitals in those states to work with veterans and to effectively pass policy that favors them. States can also not resolve the issue of doctor protections completely. States can say that it's not a risk to a professional license if a doctor is going to recommend cannabis or participate in the cannabis program. However, doctors can still not prescribe cannabis because it remains a Schedule I substance. Doctors under federal law are not allowed to prescribe Schedule I substances. So you won't see cannabis on a prescription pad while the Schedule I status remains. There is a reason, though, where doctors are protected under state law, and that comes from a court decision that says that the recommendation of medical cannabis is a First Amendment right, rather than anything that relates to a DEA registration. So that's how states have developed these programs with doctor participation. The forms that you see patients filling out and healthcare professionals filling out are called recommendation forms rather than prescription forms. But again, the ability for doctors to prescribe is something that would only be able to be changed by the federal level. And this is just an example of some of these recommendation forms. Some are very detailed. Some merely list a list of conditions and require the doctor to check which condition is appropriate. But again, there will be no prescriptions and ultimately no insurance coverage until the federal government changes the status of cannabis. So with that, that is my presentation. I welcome questions. The landscape in terms of state policy and federal policy is changing rapidly. And at times it seems like it's almost daily. So I'm happy to answer any questions either now or as they come up in the coming weeks and months. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for that informative presentation. I would also like to thank LabRoots for making today's educational webcast possible. And as a final reminder, our speaker will follow up with any questions you've submitted via email. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.